Just a nurse. That was what they called her. Not by her name, never by her name, but by the weight of her uniform and the silence she wore like body armor. They didn't know that Sarah Chen had spent 23 years making split-second decisions that kept people alive in places where the margin between life and death measured in seconds. They didn't know that the faded scrub she'd pulled on at 10:44 p.m. had once hung in a barracks locker beside a dress uniform folded with the precision of someone who understood that discipline was the only thing standing between chaos and order. Mercy General Hospital in Savannah ran the night shift like most hospitals ran their nights, fluorescent lights humming their endless mechanical prayer, the cardiac unit ticking with monitors and ventilators, the smell of antiseptic and coffee, and something darker underneath, something like fear that nobody talked about. Sarah Chen arrived at 10:45 p.m. and signed the logbook without lifting her eyes from the page. The pen moved across the paper with the same controlled precision she'd used for 2 decades to log casualty reports and medical assessments in a language that didn't exist anymore except in her muscle memory. The hallway stretched behind her, cream-colored walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the fluorescent fixtures overhead cast everything in the kind of blue-white glare that made everybody look like ghosts. She'd been working night shift at Mercy General for 3 years, and in those 3 years, not a single person at the hospital had asked her where she was really from or why her hands moved with the confidence of someone trained to operate under conditions that would make most people paralyzed with fear. That was fine. That was better than fine. That was the whole point. Sarah moved through the cardiac unit with the kind of economy of motion that suggested she understood the geography of trauma, every supply cart positioned mentally, every exit catalogued, every corner of the ward mapped like it was hostile territory. Which it wasn't. Wasn't anywhere close. But her body didn't know the difference anymore. Her body moved like it was clearing sectors. The nurse's station was a disaster of paper and computer screens glowing like warnings. 2 night nurses were already there, charting, their shoulders curved inward in the particular exhaustion that comes from graveyard shifts. Sarah set her bag down, old military duffel, weathered canvas, the kind that came from surplus stores that didn't ask questions, and logged into the computer without ceremony. Her password was the birth date of her son, backward. She'd learned long ago not to use passwords that mattered. Assignments are on the board, Maria said, not looking up from her charting. Maria had been there since Sarah started. Maria was good people. She'd learned to give Sarah space without making it obvious she was doing it. You've got cardiac monitoring on 412, post-op on 413, and we're admitting from the ER. Drunk driving. Pedestrian versus vehicle at Oak and Fifth. Sarah nodded and pulled up the first chart on the monitor. Heart rate 78. Blood pressure 122/81. Oxygen saturation 98% on room air. The vitals were listed in neat rows, and she read them the way other people read literature, for subtext and meaning and the possibility of what could go wrong in the next 6 hours. Thanks, she said, her voice soft enough that Maria had to lean forward to hear it. That was intentional. Sarah had learned early that quiet people got less attention, and less attention was the whole strategy. The break room was 2 corridors down, past the medication station where Dr. Hargrove sometimes stood making phone calls to people whose names she'd learned not to remember. She cut through the supply room instead, past the ventilators and the oxygen tanks and the crash carts that sat like sleeping sentries against the walls, and made it to the break room without encountering anyone except a resident named Thompson who nodded at her without quite meeting her eyes. Good kid. Probably wouldn't last more than 5 years. They never did if they had any sense. The break room smelled like stale coffee and the particular sadness of a microwave that had seen too much. Sarah opened her locker, B-47, 3rd row, standard grey metal, and the first thing she saw was the pair of boots. Combat boots. Desert tan. Cracked leather across the toe box from 3 deployments across the Helmand Province. Sand still in the treads, even though she'd stopped active duty 16 months ago. She'd kicked off those boots in a barracks at Kandahar and told herself she'd never put them back on, and then she'd packed them anyway because throwing them away felt like betrayal. Her hands moved toward them, stopped. She closed the locker quickly, before anyone could see. The other nurses didn't ask about personal items. They knew better than to look too closely at what people kept hidden. Coffee. Black. No sugar. She'd sworn off cream 3 years ago because it made her stomach hurt. That might have been coincidence, or it might have been something deeper, a body rejecting comfort because comfort meant lowering your guard. The coffee maker gurgled and steamed, and she stood there in her faded scrubs, watching the dark liquid fill the cup, and felt the tremor in her hand start to come on. She held it back. 23 years of holding it back. She flexed her fingers against the cup handle, let the heat ground her, and the tremor subsided like a tide going out. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. That buzz had been constant for 3 years. Some people didn't hear it anymore. Sarah had learned that hearing it was an asset. Baseline noise. Anything that changed meant pay attention. She returned to the cardiac unit and settled into the chair at the nurse's station, opening her charting on the monitor. Patient in 412 had been admitted 3 days ago with atrial fibrillation. 67-year-old male. History of hypertension. Stable now, but the monitor showed occasional runs of irregular rhythm, nothing dangerous, nothing that required emergency intervention, but the kind of thing you watched anyway because patients who seemed stable at 11 p.m. sometimes weren't stable at 2 a.m. That was what nobody talked about in the literature. That was what they only learned by staying awake for 36 hours in a combat hospital, watching someone's chest rise and fall and wondering if the next breath was coming. That one's been good tonight. Sarah looked up. Dr. Raymond Hargrove had entered the unit with his characteristic absence of ceremony, moving through the space like it had been arranged specifically for his convenience. He was tall, 6'2", maybe 6'3", with the kind of posture that came from generations of people who'd never had to apologize for taking up space. Silver at the temples. Expensive watch that caught the fluorescent light. He was wearing his white coat over a tie that probably cost more than Sarah's entire shift would pay her. She'd learned his schedule. He made rounds at midnight and 6 a.m., and he moved through the cardiac unit like he was inspecting a property he was thinking about buying. Good, Sarah said. Not too much. Not too little. Just enough to acknowledge that he'd spoken. Hargrove paused. He was looking at her in the way that people sometimes did when they sensed something that didn't quite fit. It was the same look he'd given her in the hospital cafeteria once, when she'd instinctively moved a surgical tray out of the path of an incoming stretcher before anyone had said anything. Like he was trying to solve a problem that he didn't quite have the tools for. After a moment, he moved on, gesturing to his residents, a string of younger doctors in shorter white coats, all trying to look like they belonged. Room for 12, he said. What's the story? One of the residents, Martinez, his name tag said, stepped forward. 67-year-old male, admitted 3 days ago with new-onset atrial fibrillation. Currently on rate control with metoprolol. Vital stable. The monitor shows occasional runs but nothing sustained. Electrolytes within normal limits. Hargrove nodded, looking at the monitor above the patient's bed, where the heart rhythm traced its irregular patterns across the screen. He was competent, Sarah could see that. He understood the medicine. That was somehow worse than if he'd been simply cruel. Simple cruelty was easy to dismiss. Competence wrapped in contempt was something else entirely. Acceptable, he said. Continue monitoring. If we see sustained runs, we'll consider a rate increase. He moved down the hallway, his residents trailing behind him like remoras behind a shark, and Sarah returned her attention to her charting. That was usually how it went. He came through, he checked vital signs and recent labs, he made decisions that ranged from sound to questionable, and then he left. That was the structure of the night shift. That was how you got through it. But as Hargrove reached the end of the cardiac unit, heading toward the elevator, he paused again. He turned and looked back at Sarah, standing at the nurse's station, her hands resting on the desk, her posture perfect in a way that most people wouldn't have noticed. Her eyes were on her charting, but her awareness extended through the entire unit the way an animal's did in open country. He watched her for 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Then he turned and continued to the elevator. The doors hissed open. He stepped inside without acknowledging her again. Sarah didn't relax until the elevator doors had closed and she heard the mechanical sounds of the car beginning to descend. She finished her coffee, which had gone lukewarm, and pulled up the admission paperwork for the incoming trauma case. Pedestrian versus vehicle. The ER had flagged it as minor injuries, contusions to the left leg, possible fracture of the tibia, multiple lacerations. The patient's name was Jeremy Hastings. 41 years old. Uninsured. There was a note from the ER nurse: patient is intoxicated and belligerent. 2 security guards are monitoring. Those kinds of patients sometimes lasted a few hours and then left AMA, against medical advice. Sometimes they settled down once the alcohol wore off. Sometimes they became problems that nobody wanted to think about. Sarah made a mental note to check on him around 2 a.m., when alcohol's effect sometimes shifted from disinhibition to depression, from aggression to despair. That was when people sometimes made decisions they'd regret. She knew that specific type of darkness intimately. The night stretched ahead of her, 12 hours of monitoring, charting, responding to call lights and monitor alarms, and the particular vigilance that came from knowing that the cardiac unit was a place where people's hearts could simply stop without warning. She'd spent 23 years in places where that happened without warning, where the margin between alive and not alive measured in seconds and decisions that had to be made under conditions that would paralyze most people. She understood quiet people because she was one, because quiet was a survival mechanism, because the people who shouted about their qualifications were rarely the ones you wanted next to you when things got bad. She opened the charting for room 412 and began her documentation, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the precision that came from muscle memory and the understanding that details mattered, that notation mattered, that the words you chose to describe a patient's status could make the difference between being believed and being dismissed. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer overhead, and Sarah Chen sat in the cardiac unit at Mercy General Hospital in Savannah, Georgia, keeping watch over patients who didn't know who she was, in a hospital where nobody had ever asked, in a night shift that was exactly like every other night shift, which was exactly the way she'd planned it. But that wasn't going to last very much longer. The fluorescent lights of the ER waiting area cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made time feel suspended, made minutes bleed into hours. Sarah sat reviewing discharge summaries at 10:19 p.m. when the trauma alert came through dispatch radio: car versus concrete barrier on Victory Drive, 1 male, mid-40s, possible pneumothorax. She didn't look up from her paperwork. These calls came through every shift. Most of them resolved into routine admissions, insurance verifications, the machinery of modern medicine grinding forward. At 11:04 p.m., she walked out to the parking lot for a break she didn't particularly need, just the small rebellion of stepping outside, of breathing air that hadn't been recycled through hospital ventilation filters 14 times. The lot was nearly empty. Rain from an earlier storm still pooled between asphalt sections, reflecting the security lights in perfect replicas of the sky that didn't exist above them. Her scrubs were damp. She didn't mind. That's when she saw him. A man lay crumpled between a silver sedan and a blue pickup truck, roughly 30 yards from the ambulance bay entrance. He was still conscious, gasping, his right shoulder hitching with effort that shouldn't have required that much effort. Sarah's brain catalogued details before her feet moved: distended neck veins, skin the color of old paper, tracheal deviation pushing his windpipe 2 fingers width to the left. The hiss of air escaping his pleural cavity with each desperate breath. Tension pneumothorax. The lung had collapsed and was compressing everything. He had maybe 4 minutes before his heart simply stopped. She didn't run. She moved with purpose, the kind of efficiency that looked calm because panic never entered the equation. Major. She didn't know his rank yet, but something in the way he was built, the way even dying he kept his chin level, told her. "Can you hear me?" "Can't breathe." His words came in fragments. Sarah dropped to her knees, the wet asphalt soaking through her scrub pants instantly, and her hands began moving before her mind caught up. Muscle memory. 17 years of nursing school and certifications. 23 years before that. She ran her fingers across his ribs, counting down from the clavicle. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She could feel the tension beneath her palm like a drum skin stretched too tight. I'm going to help you. She pulled a ballpoint pen from her pocket. She always carried 3, a habit from another life, and in one fluid motion broke it in half. The plastic casing would work. It had to work. She positioned the needle at the point where his ribs met, angled it toward his shoulder, and pushed. Hard. The hiss of air escaping. That exact sound. 20 years and her hand still remembered the acoustics of dying. His body convulsed, gasping, and then suddenly the asphalt beneath him wasn't moving anymore. His chest was rising and falling like a normal human's chest, like the laws of physics hadn't been trying to murder him 30 seconds prior. Color began creeping back into his face in real time. Okay. Okay, you're stabilizing. Her voice was level, professional, the voice she used on all her night shifts. Ambulance is coming. Just breathe. Just keep breathing. But she wasn't watching his chest anymore. She was watching his face. Recognition hit her like a physical blow. Not his adult features, those were unfamiliar, weathered by years that had carved new topography into bone structure. But his eyes. Dark brown with that particular shade of amber you only saw in children from certain regions, certain bloodlines. She had held those eyes once, in Helmand Province, in a firefight in the Jolan sector where the house they were clearing had a basement and the basement had children, and one small boy with those exact eyes had been screaming in Pashto while his sisters huddled behind him, and she had carried him, this boy, this child, this person whose face she had looked at while rounds came through the wall and dust fell like snow, out of that building and to the FOB and to the medics, and he was alive, he made it. They told her he made it. This man had those eyes. The ambulance arrived at 11:09 p.m., the paramedics moving with that particular unhurried efficiency that meant they weren't arriving to an emergency anymore. Sarah stepped back as they loaded him, gave them the vitals she'd been tracking, mentioned casually that she'd performed needle decompression at the midclavicular line, second intercostal space, and watched them load him into the bay. She didn't see the EMT radioing ahead, Mercy General, incoming is Major Walsh, 42-year-old male, tension pneumo resolved on scene by, looks like a nurse. Yeah, she did a needle decompression with a ballpoint pen casing. He's stable now. The drive bay doors swung shut. The ambulance pulled away. Sarah stood in the parking lot with rain beginning again, her scrub soaked, her hand steady, and tried to remember how to breathe like a person who hadn't just encountered a ghost she'd spent 20 years burying. 2 days passed. 2 full shifts where Sarah moved through the hospital like she was operating on a 7-second delay, present but not present, completing her tasks with mechanical precision. She hadn't seen Major Walsh again. Word was he was stable, would probably discharge within the week, had some kind of special clearance that moved him to a private room on a higher floor. Part of her was grateful for the distance. That gratitude ended at 7:34 a.m. during morning rounds. Dr. Raymond Hargrove appeared at the nurse's station with that particular expression he reserved for demonstrations of his authority, eyebrows raised like someone had just presented him with spoiled meat. Behind him came Mrs. Patterson, a woman whose husband had been admitted 3 days ago for post-surgical complications. The family looked confused. Sarah, restocking the medication dispensary 3 stations away, watched it unfold. Nurse Chen. It wasn't a greeting. It was a summons. The way he spoke her name, you'd think it was a diagnosis. Perhaps you'd like to explain to Mrs. Patterson why her husband's discharge paperwork contains a charting error that could have resulted in medication complications? Or is attention to detail not a priority for someone who thinks a nursing degree makes them a physician? The question hung in the air like smoke. Other staff were watching now. The charge nurse had gone very still. Sarah set down the medication tray and moved toward them. She could see the error on the page he was holding, a decimal point in the wrong place, a dosage that was correct in practice but wrong in notation. It was her hand that had written it. She'd caught it during her second review, corrected it before any medication could leave the dispensary, but the original had apparently been the one filed. She took one measured breath. Let it out. felt the weight of being observed, which was nothing compared to the weight of being 30 seconds away from a man's heart stopping in a parking lot, which was nothing compared to the weight of carrying a child through gunfire. So this moment, this humiliation, this public demonstration of Dr. Hargrove's need to establish dominance, was less than nothing. A tear escaped her left eye. One tear. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, and when she spoke, her voice didn't waver. The error was mine, Dr. Hargrove. It's been corrected as of 0600 this morning. Mrs. Patterson, your husband's care was never compromised. The medication he received was correctly dosed. I personally verified it before administration. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He'd been expecting either aggression or collapse. What he got was calm accountability, which was somehow more infuriating. He cut her off before she could say anything else. This is exactly the problem with nurses who don't know their place. He walked away. Mrs. Patterson looked embarrassed. The charge nurse quietly made her way back to the computer. The break room that afternoon smelled like burnt coffee and that particular mustiness that happened when 7 people sat in a 12 by 15-foot space with no windows. Sarah sat down at the table, pulled out her lunch container, and for approximately 14 seconds, the 4 nurses who had been laughing were still laughing. Then they registered her presence. One by one, they stood. They didn't say anything. Their coffee cups remained steaming on the table, abandoned mid-conversation. Sarah sat alone for the rest of her break. That evening, the formal reprimand appeared on the unit board. Printed, laminated, impossible to miss. It read, Incident Report, RN Sarah Chen performed unauthorized medical intervention in hospital parking lot without physician supervision or proper documentation protocols. Practicing outside scope of nursing license. This behavior compromises patient safety standards and violates Hospital Procedure 4.2.1. Written warning placed in personnel file. Beneath it, in an almost formal calligraphy of whispers, everyone had something to say. He's calling you Cowboy Chen behind your back, the charge nurse Linda whispered during the evening shift change. Says you think you're special. Says you probably made up some story about trauma medicine to impress people. Sarah was charting in the electronic system, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same precision she'd used on the asphalt 2 nights ago. She didn't look away from the screen. I know exactly what my place is, Doctor, she said quietly. I'm just wondering if you know yours. Linda's eyes widened. She hadn't expected the protagonist in this story to speak back. Sarah finished her charting. Continued her shift. Handed off her patients at shift change without any of the usual banter. The combat boots remained in her locker, undisturbed in the darkness, where they'd been waiting for 3 years to be needed again. 5 days later, at 2:14 a.m., the cardiac monitor in room 447 began screaming its particular mechanical scream. The alarm came through first, that urgent beep 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 that every nurse in the hospital heard in their bones, the sound that made baseline heart rate elevate by approximately 20 beats per minute. The code was called. Sarah was 2 doors down, already moving. The patient was a 62-year-old male, post-operative, his heart having apparently decided that scar tissue and sutures were insufficient cause for continued beating. His monitor showed ventricular fibrillation. The on-call physician was stuck in the ICU with a trauma case, ETA 8 minutes. The on-call cardiologist was not answering her page. 8 minutes was for minutes too long. Sarah arrived at the door of 447 at the same moment the crash cart did. She was moving before anyone assigned her authority to move. Start compressions, she said. I want rotations every 2 minutes. We're pushing 1 of epi, 2-minute intervals. The residents and nursing assistants exchanged the kind of glance that meant they were uncertain of the chain of command, but her voice, that particular tone, that particular register, was the kind that suggested these were not suggestions. A second-year resident named Morrison moved immediately to the patient's chest, laced his hands, and began compressions with that mechanical rhythm. Charge to 200, Sarah said, and someone was already moving the defibrillator pads into position. She could feel her body shifting into a different operational mode, the way her breathing became deeper, the way time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. 2 minutes and rotate. Come on, keep pushing. Morrison was sweating. He'd been taught this in med school but had probably never seen someone run a code like it was grid coordinates, like it was muscle memory older than his residency. The patient's monitor showed the shock delivering, showed the flat line, showed the asystole that meant they were still losing him. Resume compressions. Get me a 12 lead. I want to know if we have a reversible rhythm here. The second shock. The third. At 4 minutes and 30 seconds, the monitor shifted. Sinus rhythm. Imperfect, but beating. The patient's lips took on a faint tint of something other than grey. Sarah stepped back. She was breathing hard now, the only sign that her nervous system had been activated. Get him to the cath lab. Call the cardiologist again. Tell her we have a potential MI pattern and active myocardial ischemia. She began documenting the code with hands that seemed to belong to someone else entirely, someone who had experience running medical emergencies in field conditions where there was no documentation, just the simple fact of keeping people alive. She'd been documented differently then. She'd been called something else. She'd worn boots instead of these shoes that squeaked against the hospital linoleum like mice being hunted. Upstairs, 3 floors above, Major Walsh heard the commotion. The particular cadence of a code blue carries through hospital walls, and something in that organized chaos, that calm voice cutting through panic, made him remember a night in Helmand Province when someone had moved with that exact same precision, when someone had saved his life while there were still people trying to take it away. He asked his nurse who was running the code. She didn't know. She just knew it was someone on the cardiac unit. Someone very, very good. Downstairs, Dr. Hargrove arrived in 447 exactly 5 minutes after the code had ended. He reviewed the code sheet with that particular expression of someone reading a letter written in a language he'd forgotten he could speak. The handwriting was unmistakable. The sequence of interventions was textbook. The patient was alive. He turned to the charge nurse without any particular inflection. Get me everything on Chen. Every shift report. Every evaluation. Every credential on file. By morning. He pulled out his phone and made 3 calls in succession, one to the board chair, one to the state nursing board, one to the employment verification company. His voice remained level throughout. Professional. Lethal in its precision. The night shift continued around him. Code blue came and went. Patients lived or didn't. The hospital breathed its mechanical breath, and somewhere in the building, a woman with combat boots in a locker was trying to remember why she'd ever thought she could hide. The break room at Mercy General smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent hum, a sound most people didn't consciously hear but felt like a migraine building behind their eyes. Sarah sat at the plastic table with her lunch container, unopened, and watched the math happen in real time. Dr. Hargrove had orchestrated this with the precision of a military operation, which meant it was efficient and thorough and designed to break people who didn't understand they were already broken. A resident named Chen, no relation, walked in first. Saw Sarah. Froze. Then turned and walked directly back out without a word. 53 seconds later, 2 nurses from the day shift entered, saw her at the table, exchanged a glance that required no words, and relocated to the hallway. By hour 2 of her shift, the unspoken instruction had crystallized into ritual. When Sarah sat, people stood and left. Not quickly, not dramatically. Just inevitably, like a gravitational pull in reverse. She could have eaten in her car. She could have skipped lunch. But Sarah had learned a long time ago that showing weakness was the same as confirming guilt, so she sat in that break room and did not touch her food and did not look up when Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway at 9:22 p.m. with a clipboard and the expression of a man who had practiced this moment in a mirror. Sarah. Not Ms. Chen. Just her first name, casual, dismissive. We need to discuss the charting error from room for 12. She stood. Protocol demanded she stand when a physician addressed her. This was not military protocol, This was something softer, institutional. She was smaller standing than she had ever been. The family's been complaining, Hargrove continued, and his voice had the practiced rhythm of a man who'd rehearsed this before an audience. 3 residents lingered in the doorway, pretending not to listen. You documented the patient's intake time as 8:15 when it was actually 8:20. 5 minutes. One of many procedural oversights I've noticed. Sarah did not blink. She did not feel the heat of embarrassment or the sting of injustice. She felt what she always felt under pressure, clarity, like the world had suddenly sharpened into focus and everything unnecessary had fallen away. Her hands remained at her sides. That was a clerical error, Doctor. I can correct it in the system. The point, Hargrove said, and his voice rose slightly, enough that his audience could hear him clearly, is that this represents a pattern of carelessness I can no longer overlook. You're a good nurse, Sarah. But good nurses don't cut corners. Good nurses don't improvise. Good nurses follow the hierarchy that keeps this hospital functioning. He paused, letting that settle. Do you understand what I'm saying? Sarah understood. The charting error was irrelevant. The point was authority. The point was that he could humiliate her and she would stand there and take it because that's what junior staff did. That's what invisible people did. I understand, Doctor. I hope so. He turned to leave, then turned back, and when he spoke again his voice had dropped into something quieter, more dangerous. Because the next time I catch you acting outside your scope, we're going to have a much more formal conversation. We're going to involve HR. We're going to involve credentials. And we're going to discuss whether someone with your background should be working in a hospital at all. The door closed behind him. The residents dispersed. Sarah sat back down. Her lunch was still unopened. She picked it up, threw it away, and clocked in for the rest of her shift without eating anything at all. But that wasn't the worst part. 5 days later, the worst part arrived at 2:34 a.m. in the form of a 62-year-old man named Robert Morrison in room 447 who had come in for a routine cardiac workup and whose heart had apparently decided that 2:34 a.m. was an excellent time to stop cooperating. Sarah was charting when the alarm went off, 3 ascending beeps that meant the monitor had switched from something relatively normal to something the machine considered a threat. She moved before the alarm finished its second cycle. The on-call cardiologist was Dr. Elliot Price, who had a reputation for being approximately 17 minutes slower than most medical emergencies required. At 2:41 a.m., he was still answering pages. At 2:46 a.m., he was still en route. The resident on call, a first-year named Mitchell who'd spent most of his rotation watching other people make decisions, was standing outside the room looking like someone had asked him to defuse a bomb with a butter knife. Sarah was already inside. She'd placed Morrison flat, initiated chest compressions with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this before, many times, under circumstances that made a Savannah Hospital ICU look like a luxury resort. Her compressions matched the rhythm of the BG's Staying Alive, which had been standard practice for 17 years, and she'd never missed a beat. Charge to 200, she said, and her voice had changed. The hospital voice, deferential, questioning, was gone. This was the voice that gave orders, and it cut through the panicked energy like a scalpel. Mitchell grabbed the defibrillator paddles. Sarah, I'm the resident, You should get the crash cart if it's not here, and you should get Dr. Price on the phone and tell him ETA, now. Not a request. It was a command, and the tone of it made Mitchell move without further argument. The defibrillator charged with its distinctive whine, a sound that made time feel smaller, more compressed. Sarah positioned the paddles, called clear with the automatic authority of someone who'd called clear in conditions that would make Morrison's situation look like a dress rehearsal, and delivered 200 joules of electricity to a chest that had decided to betray its owner. The monitor showed nothing for a moment. Then the rhythm changed, complex, disorganized, a ventricular fibrillation that was technically something but certainly not something sustainable. Sarah initiated compressions again without missing a beat. Breathe, push, 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 push. Breathe, push, 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 Push. Her hands moved with the kind of economy of motion that suggested she'd practiced this exact sequence on dozens of bodies that couldn't practice back. For in, she asked. Right wrist, Mitchell said. He'd gotten an 4-line placed while Sarah did the defibrillation, which meant he was actually competent when he wasn't frozen. Saline lock. Push epi, 1 mg 4. Sarah didn't look up from her compressions. Her voice remained flat, factual. Push once every 3 minutes. Second shock in 90 seconds if we don't convert. Mitchell pushed the epinephrine, 1 mg of a drug designed to make a failing heart want to beat again, and Sarah continued compressions with a kind of mechanical precision that suggested her arms were separate from her body, operating on their own intelligence. Oxygen saturation climbing. Blood pressure holding. The monitor still showing chaos, but a chaos that was responding to stimuli, which meant Morrison's heart was still listening, still capable of understanding the language of electricity and chemistry. 2 floors above them, in room 638 where Major Walsh was supposed to be sleeping off his own cardiac crisis, he heard the commotion. He didn't hear the specifics, the hospital had decent soundproofing, but he heard the rhythm of it, the cadence of people moving in synchronized urgency, and something in that pattern reached into his sleep-addled brain and pulled him toward memory. Helmand Province, Sanjin Valley, 2004. A 6-year-old boy with a chest wound and blood that wouldn't stop coming. A woman with hands that moved like she'd rehearsed this exact scenario 1,000 times, calling orders in a voice that suggested she'd seen worse. A voice that cut through panic like it was nothing. A woman's voice. Walsh sat up fast enough that his own monitor protested, then forced himself to move slow, methodical, controlled. He'd been trained to recognize threats and opportunities. He'd been trained to see what was hidden in plain sight. He'd been trained to piece together intelligence from fragments. And right now, the fragments were suggesting something impossible was happening 2 floors below him. He pulled up his phone. Found Sarah's face in his memory of her, the way she'd looked at him in that parking lot when she recognized something in his eyes. He accessed a database he theoretically shouldn't still have access to, ran her photo through the military identification protocol, and got a response that made his breath catch, classified. Protected location. Clearance required for further access. He made a call. His commander answered on the second ring, which suggested he was either awake or had trained himself to become awake instantly for calls at 2:51 a.m. Sir, I need you to run a name for me. Sarah Chen. The database says she's classified, protected location. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, Major, stand by. It took 14 minutes for the callback. 14 minutes during which Walsh watched the activity in the hallway below, personnel moving with purpose, a crash cart being pushed at speed, emergency energy that suggested either a save or a loss about to be determined. His commander's voice was different when it came back. Careful. Sarah Chen. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Her file is sealed following a classified operation in Helmand Province in 2004. She provided testimony against a terrorist cell. Her location is protected. If you've located her, you need to report it through proper channels only, and you need to do it now. Walsh looked at his own scar. The bullet wound that had never quite healed right because it had been received when he was 6 years old and the bullet had gone through his shoulder and come very close to stopping his heart. He'd spent his entire life not knowing that a woman with blood on her hands and a voice like a battlefield prayer had been the difference between a future and a grave. 2 floors below, Sarah delivered the second shock at the 90-second mark. The monitor converted. A rhythm that wasn't sinus, but wasn't fibrillation either. The liminal space between dying and living where most emergency medicine happened. O2 sat, she asked. 94%, Mitchell reported. Climbing. Pressure. 88/56 and holding. Sarah didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply continued doing what she'd trained her entire body to understand, the language that heart spoke when they were terrified and desperate and asking for help. Dr. Price arrived 6 minutes later and immediately stepped aside because he'd been doing this for long enough to recognize competence in another human being, and Sarah Chen radiated the kind of competence that only came from having done this work in conditions where mistakes meant more than paperwork. "You did good," Price said quietly, and it wasn't a question, and it wasn't praise, it was recognition between two people who understood that Morrison was alive right now because someone had answered the emergency with a precision that looked like magic but was actually just muscle memory that had learned its lessons in Helmand Province, in 2004, in a world where 6-year-old boys with brown eyes deserved to live. Sarah never acknowledged the compliment. She simply moved to the next task, and the next, and the next, and somewhere in the building, a major with a protected file and a classified history lay in his recovery bed and made a decision that was going to change everything. The Emergency Review Committee convened 48 hours after the code blew, and Dr. Raymond Hargrove didn't waste time with pleasantries. He sat at the head of the polished mahogany conference table in the hospital's executive wing, his tailored suit pressed to surgical precision, his fingers steepled in the manner of a man who'd spent 3 decades weaponizing bureaucracy. To his left sat Administrator Patricia Edwards, who'd built her career following whoever held institutional power. To his right was a woman named Dr. Lydia Foster from the State Nursing Board, a consulting investigator with the kind of neutral expression that concealed a sharpened blade. Hargrove had called in favors, 3 phone calls that morning to board members, 2 to the state licensing office, 1 to a colleague at Johns Hopkins who'd written a testimonial about his leadership. He'd built his power like architecture, brick by brick, and Sarah Chen had threatened the structural integrity of his carefully constructed domain. The incident in a parking lot was only the beginning, Hargrove began, his voice measured and reasonable, the voice of a man solving problems, not creating them. A nurse without proper credentials performing invasive procedures outside her scope of practice. But when she ran the code blue without attending physician present, that became patient endangerment. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of the code documentation, Sarah's nursing notes highlighted in yellow, and a memo he'd written himself questioning the legality of her actions. "I've taken the liberty of contacting her references from her previous employers." The picture that emerged is concerning. Dr. Foster leaned forward, her pen poised above a legal pad. "What kind of concerning?" "Gaps in her employment history," Hargrove said smoothly. "Vague explanations for her transitions between facilities. One reference from a clinic in Portland that hasn't returned my calls, the clinic no longer exists, actually. Another from a VA hospital in Tacoma where the director claims no record of employment for anyone by her name." He paused, letting the implication settle like sediment in water. When you combine that with her demonstrated knowledge of procedures that exceed standard nursing curriculum, well, one has to wonder if her credentials are genuine at all. Patricia Edwards exchanged a glance with Dr. Foster. The trap was closing, and it was closing quietly. "I've also reviewed her disciplinary record since employment," Hargrove continued, turning the page. "The charting error. Her attitude during performance feedback. Her documented resistance to the chain of command. Then, 6 days ago, she performs a procedure with no physician authorization. Yesterday, she runs a full resuscitation without waiting for the attending. The pattern suggests either someone who fundamentally misunderstands their role or someone concealing their true credentials and pretending to work within constraints that don't actually apply to her training." He sat back, the picture of concerned leadership. "I'm recommending immediate termination for misrepresentation and repeatedly exceeding nursing protocols." Dr. Foster made a note. "Has she been notified?" "I wanted the board's consensus first," Hargrove said, which was a lie. He'd already prepared the termination paperwork yesterday evening. The meeting lasted 43 minutes. The vote was unanimous. Security arrived at Sarah's workstation at 3:38 p.m., 2 guards in navy blazers with the kind of professional detachment reserved for escorting people from buildings. Sarah was charting vitals on a patient in room for 12, and when she saw them, she didn't flinch. She simply saved her notes, logged out, and followed them downstairs to her locker. The nursing staff watched from doorways and medication stations as she was walked through the corridors like someone under arrest, though no one had committed a crime except against her. Her locker smelled like stale coffee and the lavender sack her son had given her 3 years ago for Mother's Day. She removed the items in silence, a spare pair of scrubs folded to exact thirds, a ceramic mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in peeling letters, a photograph of Marcus from his 8th grade soccer season, his gap-toothed smile impossibly bright. Then she reached for the bottom, where she'd wrapped the combat boots in an old Navy PT shirt, grey fabric that once bore the insignia of the 160th SAW, a unit she'd never allowed anyone to know she'd been attached to. The boots were scuffed and worn, the soles nearly smooth, the leather cracked at the heel where she'd run 15 kilometers through Helmand Province with a 6-year-old child in her arms and 30 rounds in her magazine and the absolute certainty that if she stopped moving, they both died. She placed them on top of the folded scrubs in the cardboard box that security had provided. The boots were heavier than they should have been, weighted with 20 years of things no one could see. "Your access badge," the guard said. Not unkindly, but empty of inflection. Sarah unclipped it from her scrub pocket and placed it in his outstretched palm. The weight of her identity fell away as cleanly as dropping a weapon. Dr. Hargrove watched from the nurse's station, his arms crossed, watching her leave with the satisfaction of a man who'd solved a problem. As security walked Sarah toward the exit, he called out, not to her, but to the staff behind the desk, "Make sure her access is fully deactivated. All systems, all buildings, effective immediately." He paused, then added, "And remove her from the staffing rotation." The word "remove" carried the weight of erasure, as if she'd never existed in the system at all. Sarah drove home on autopilot, her hands on the steering wheel, her eyes on the road, her mind somewhere in 2004 in a valley that didn't exist anymore. The cardboard box sat in the passenger seat, and the weight of it was the only thing that felt real. She parked in her driveway at 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, sat motionless for 20 minutes while the engine cooled, and then walked into her house like someone entering a tomb. Marcus found her at the kitchen table an hour later. She was sitting with the boots in front of her, still wrapped in the PT shirt, her hands gripping them the way a drowning person grips driftwood. He walked in with his backpack slung over one shoulder, ready to complain about a calculus test, and stopped dead in the doorway. "Mom." She looked up, and for a moment, just one, he saw something in her face that he'd never seen before. Not sadness, though sadness was there. Something rawer. Something that looked like someone whose house had just burned down. "Why are you home?" he asked, already knowing the answer wasn't going to make sense. "I made a mistake at work," Sarah said, and her voice sounded like someone translating from a language she'd never fully learned. "I got fired." Marcus stepped closer to the table. He was 14, tall enough that his eyes were nearly level with hers when he stood across from her. He was old enough to know when an adult was lying, even if they believed it was a kindness. He pointed at the boots. "Mom, what are those?" She looked down at them, these things she'd hidden for so long that looking at them felt like betrayal. "Nothing, sweetie. Just old shoes." But Marcus saw her grip tighten. Saw her knuckles whiten. Saw the way her jaw clenched, a movement like a door slamming shut. He'd seen that movement before, always right before she changed the channel on the news or looked away from a military ceremony on television. Right before she went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with speaking. "They're not just shoes," Marcus said. Sarah couldn't find words. The gap between the mother who made his lunch and the woman sitting at this table holding the last evidence of who she'd been felt wider than the Helmand Valley. She couldn't tell him about the 23 lives documented in commendations locked in a safety deposit box at First Citizens Bank. Couldn't tell him about the citation that read actions under fire while extracting wounded personnel, or the 2 Purple Hearts she'd never worn, or the Bronze Star that had arrived in her name at a VA hospital in Delaware where she'd used her maiden name to collect it. Couldn't tell him about the 6-year-old boy with terrified eyes who became a major with eyes just as familiar. Couldn't bridge the distance between the silence she'd maintained and the truth that was sitting on her kitchen table wrapped in old navy cloth. "I just need to rest," she said, which was the smallest lie she could manage. That night, after she fell asleep on the couch with her hand still reaching toward the boots, Marcus went upstairs to the attic. he moved through boxes of Christmas decorations and old photo albums and things stored away like relics, and behind the bin labeled holiday he found it, a shadow box crafted from mahogany and glass, and inside, arranged with military precision, were medals that caught the fluorescent light like captured stars. His hands trembled as he read the ribbons. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Navy Commendation Medal with Combat V. And below them, a folded flag in a triangular formation, pressed so tightly it looked ceremonial, sacred, the kind of flag that was given to families at funerals. He found documentation inside, citations with his mother's name printed in official military language, words like extraordinary heroism and actions under fire and while protecting civilian casualties. There was a photograph of his mother in Navy dress uniform, hair short, jaw tight, eyes that looked through the camera at something impossible to see from the outside. The woman in the photograph was his mother, but she was also someone else entirely, someone hard and capable and impossibly distant. He sat on the attic floor for an hour, holding the shadow box, understanding that his mother had survived things he couldn't imagine. Understanding that she'd chosen not to tell him. Understanding that the woman downstairs crying at a kitchen table had been waiting 20 years for someone to give her permission to stop hiding. The next morning at 6:56 a.m., he made a decision that was going to change everything. 3 days after her termination, Sarah returned to the Mercy General parking lot at dawn. She'd left a bag of personal items in her car's trunk when security had rushed her out, her favorite pen, the picture of Marcus from kindergarten, a jacket she'd owned for 12 years. The parking lot was still dark, the light that mattered not yet broken across the horizon, and the asphalt was cold against her bare feet. She'd taken her shoes off in the car, unwrapped the combat boots from their PT shirt, and laced them with muscle memory that bypassed thought entirely. The boots fit like they'd been waiting. Like they'd never left her feet at all. She was bent into her trunk, moving items from one bag to another, when she heard the sound of running footsteps behind her. "Mom!" Marcus ran across the parking lot carrying something heavy, breathing hard, his 14-year-old legs pumping, his voice breaking with the kind of urgency that meant something had shifted in the world. Behind him, the sound came next, not footsteps, but synchronized rhythm, the unmistakable cadence of boots on asphalt moving in formation. Sarah turned, and the blood drained from her face so completely that the world tilted slightly. Major Walsh stood at attention in dress uniform, his shoulders squared, his posture a perfect vertical line. Behind him, they formed a corridor that seemed to stretch across the entire parking lot, 75 soldiers in service dress, standing shoulder to shoulder, 2 lines of green and tan and the particular bearing that belonged only to people who'd seen things that changed them. The rotor wash from a distant helicopter shook the air, though no aircraft was visible yet. The sound carried authority in itself. 3 days of silence. That was all it took for Sarah Chen to stop being a person and start being a ghost. The cardboard box had sat in her car trunk for 72 hours, her locker's contents still smelling of hospital antiseptic and broken hope. She'd driven to Mercy General at dawn without planning to, without deciding. Her hands had simply turned the wheel into the same parking lot where she'd saved a man's life and lost her own in the process. The asphalt was wet from overnight rain. Her shoes stuck slightly with each step as she moved toward her sedan, movements mechanical, the kind of empty compliance a body performs when the mind has already checked out. She opened the trunk. The box was still there. 3 stacks of folded scrubs. A stethoscope she'd bought with her own money. A name badge that read Vest Chen, RN, with a photo of a woman who looked terrified of being seen. She reached for the box to throw it away. The rain had softened the cardboard, made it fragile enough to collapse, when a voice stopped her. "Mom." Marcus stood 10 feet away, breathing hard like he'd run from the car. 14 years old, built lean like his father, but with Sarah's eyes, the kind that saw too much too young. He was holding something. A shadow box. Wood frame, glass front, navy blue velvet backing. And mounted on that backing, arranged in a precise diamond formation, were medals. Bronze Star with its distinctive purple and white ribbon. 2 purple hearts, their silver hearts catching the grey morning light. Navy Commendation Medal with Combat Distinguishing Device. And lower, partially hidden by the frame's edge, the outline of something else. Something larger. "Marcus, where did you?" "The attic. In the old footlocker." His voice was steady in a way that broke her. "I was looking for the Christmas boxes. I found this instead. Found the boots too. They're in my room." He held the shadow box out, and his hands were shaking, but his voice wasn't. "Mom, they need to see these. These are real." The rain intensified. Started to hammer the parking lot like applause, like a standing ovation for a performance that was finally ending. Sarah's breath caught, and for a moment, just a moment, her composure cracked. She reached for the shadow box with hands that suddenly felt foreign to her body, hands that had saved lives but couldn't seem to hold onto her own. Marcus stepped closer. And then the rotor wash hit them both. The sound came first. A distant beating of the air, growing closer, growing louder, until it shook the car windows and scattered the rain sideways. Sarah's head snapped up. Helicopter. Military rotors. The specific cadence of a UH-60 Black Hawk approaching fast. She turned toward the sound just as it appeared above the tree line, the bird descending toward the far end of the parking lot, its nose pointing downward with the precision of a predatory strike. It landed 300 meters away. The rotors slowed but didn't stop, keeping the engine hot, the aircraft ready for immediate departure. And as the dust settled around the landing skids, soldiers emerged. 75 of them. That was the number that would be reported later, verified in the incident log, confirmed by 3 separate witnesses. They moved as a single organism, synchronized in the way that only thousands of hours of training produces, not marching, not filing out, but flowing. They wore dress blues, the dark navy and gold of Special Forces dress uniform, and they moved across the parking lot in a formation that looked like a corridor. 2 lines, 40 soldiers per line, with a 15-foot gap between them. Military bearing. Shoulders back. Eyes forward. Boots on asphalt creating a rhythm that built with every step, thump, 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 thump. They created a pathway. A corridor that began at the helicopter and extended toward the hospital entrance. And walking at the front of them, moving with the particular confidence of a man who had crossed deserts and mountains and survived things that reshape a human being, Major Walsh. He was fully uniformed, fully healed, his chest bare of medals. The healing wound Sarah had addressed 3 weeks earlier was now just a memory, just scar tissue under dress blues. He stopped 20 feet from Sarah and Marcus, and his voice carried across the parking lot with the authority of command structure and something deeper, something that sounded like recognition married to debt. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. Not a question. Not a greeting. A formal acknowledgement, the kind of address reserved for ceremonies and military record setting. Sarah's entire body went rigid. Her son turned toward her, confusion and dawning understanding mixing in his expression. And that's when the hospital doors opened. The hospital administrator emerged first, moving fast, his confusion visible from a distance. Behind him came a nurse, Jennifer, the one who'd read Sarah's file during the investigation, and she was holding a tablet. Her hands were shaking so badly the device nearly slipped from her grip. The administrator's mouth moved, but no sound reached Sarah's position. He was trying to understand what was happening. Trying to calculate the military presence, the soldiers in formation, the purpose of a Black Hawk in his parking lot. Jennifer stepped forward. Her voice was trembling, but when she spoke, each word struck like a hammer against anvil. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Elizabeth Chen. Navy designation, Special Warfare Combat Medic. Service record, 23 years. Theater deployments, 4. Rank attained, Senior Chief Petty Officer in the Naval Special Warfare Command. She paused, struggling with the tremor in her voice. It's all here. All of it. Everything real. A man in uniform stepped out from the formation. Colonel. His chest was a constellation of medals, Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, Bronze Star with V device. His name tape read Mitchell. His voice was flat, exact, The kind of precision that comes from giving orders to people whose lives depend on accuracy. Senior Chief Chen's Helmand Province deployment, 2003 to 2004, resulted in the extraction of high-value intelligence assets and the disruption of a Taliban supply network spanning 3 provinces. Her testimony to the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Federal Bureau of Investigation led to the identification and neutralization of 17 enemy command nodes. He paused. Each would seem to land in a space where sound went to die. Senior Chief Chen was classified under federal protection. Her location, her identity, her service record, all classified. News vans were arriving now. Sarah could see them pulling into the far end of the parking lot, cameras emerging like predators sensing blood in the water. But she wasn't watching the cameras. She was watching Walsh, who stepped forward and took the shadow box from Marcus with a gentleness that suggested he understood exactly how precious a thing it was. Walsh opened the frame. He looked at each medal. His jaw tightened in the way it does when someone is holding something back, holding grief or rage or recognition so tightly that the whole structure of the face becomes a container for pressure. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Lower. Rougher. Like gravel being dragged across concrete. Bronze Star with Valor. He lifted his eyes to Sarah, and in them was the entire 20-year arc of a life saved and lived and returned to its source. Purple Heart. Another beat. The soldiers in formation stood motionless, witnessing. Navy Commendation Medal for the extraction and security of civilian assets in hostile territory. His voice cracked slightly, the first and only sound of genuine emotion in the ceremony. And the Navy Cross. The Navy Cross, Senior Chief. For extraordinary heroism. That medal sits above all of them, and you buried it in an attic. Sarah's breathing had stopped. She couldn't pull air into her lungs in a way that felt connected to her body anymore. She was watching Walsh, watching the soldiers, watching the hospital administrator's face undergo a transformation from confusion to horror to something worse, the kind of recognition that comes when you understand you've committed an unforgivable error. The kind of knowledge that destroys careers. The FBI liaison stepped forward. Suit, not uniform. Badge visible. His voice carried the particular flatness of federal authority, the kind that doesn't require inflection because the institution behind it is a mountain. Senior Chief Chen's location has been maintained under federal classified protection for 18 years. Her mission in Helmand Province involved gathering intelligence on Taliban movement. Her testimony in 2005 resulted in the identification of a weapons smuggling network operating across Pakistan and Afghanistan. That network was dismantled. The men she helped identify and apprehend are no longer operational. He paused. Let that settle. Dr. Raymond Hargrove made unauthorized inquiries into Senior Chief Chen's background. He contacted 3 federal agencies, 2 veteran service organizations, and 2 private background check databases. Those inquiries triggered security alerts. They compromised her location protection. The hospital doors opened again. Dr. Hargrove emerged, and Sarah watched his face go white. His mouth opened and closed without sound. He looked like a man watching his own execution in real time, watching the blade descend and understanding finally, too late, that every choice had led to this moment. The hospital board chair was behind him. Sarah recognized her, Margaret Chen, no relation, the chief medical officer who had seemed sympathetic when Sarah was being fired. She was holding her phone and her expression suggested she'd been on the call with legal and PR for the last 20 minutes. When she spoke, her voice was clinical and final. Dr. Hargrove, you are terminated for cause, effective immediately. Your actions constitute breach of federal protection protocols, unauthorized inquiry into classified personnel records, discrimination against a protected veteran, and endangerment of a federal asset. Security will escort you from the premises. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Authority doesn't require volume. The security guard, the same man who had escorted Sarah out 3 days earlier, approached Hargrove. The doctor's face went from white to crimson. This is insane. I was following hospital protocol. I wasn't aware, I couldn't possibly have known, his voice cracked. I've been chief of staff for 15 years. The board chair's response was a single sentence, delivered with the kind of mercy that feels like cruelty. And in 15 minutes, you'll be unemployed. Leave. The cameras got it all. Every word. Every image. Dr. Hargrove being escorted through the corridor of soldiers, his credentials stripped, his authority evaporated like morning frost. A reporter shouted from beyond the military perimeter, "Dr. Hargrove, did you know you were firing a war hero?" He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Just kept walking, becoming smaller with each step. Sarah stood in the rain, in her worn scrubs, while 75 soldiers created a living monument around her. Major Walsh approached, and in his hands was something she hadn't seen in 20 years, the pair of combat boots he'd found in her locker. Desert tan. Salt-stained. The left boot had a small gouge in the leather from a bullet that had missed vital tissue by 3 millimeters. He placed them on the ground at her feet. "You carried me out once, Senior Chief. When I was 6 years old and bleeding through a wound that should have killed me. You applied a tourniquet. You kept talking to me in English even though I didn't understand. You told me to stay awake, told me help was coming, told me to think about what I wanted to be when I grew up." His voice was steady now, solid as bedrock. "I wanted to be you, Senior Chief. That's what I told you then. That's what I've been doing for the last 20 years. Sarah looked at the boots. Looked at her son's face. Looked at the soldiers standing at attention, their presence a physical manifestation of gratitude and recognition. And for the first time since she'd taken off her uniform 18 years ago, she allowed herself to be seen. The rain fell harder. Reporters were shouting questions that nobody answered. Cameras flashed like lightning. But in the center of that storm, surrounded by soldiers and medals and the weight of a life finally, fully reclaimed, Sarah Chen stood in her worn scrubs and simply breathed. Walsh saluted her. Chest high, precise, the geometry of respect. Every soldier in the formation followed. 75 people standing at the position of honor, their hands raised in acknowledgement of something larger than protocol, the recognition of a warrior who'd been invisible, now finally seen. Marcus gripped the shadow box, and tears streamed down his face. His mother. The real version. The full version. The one who'd spent years being small because the world had demanded it, and who was finally, impossibly, allowed to be large again. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were, if you've ever had to hide the most important parts of yourself just to survive in a space that wasn't built for your magnitude, subscribe. Because the people who change the world are rarely the loudest ones in the room. They're the ones with the quietly devastating calm, the ones who carry decades of secrets, the ones waiting for the moment when hiding finally ends. Hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to understand that true class isn't what you do when the lights are on. It's what you do when the world stops watching and you choose to show up anyway. Comment, what would you have done in Sarah's position? Would you have carried that weight alone for 18 years, or would you have found another way?